with a clap, can you please help me introduce to you Ms. Diane Ewart Mills.
Thank you so much. Wow. Listening to that, thinking, did I do all of that? Is that really me? But it's been a real pleasure, and it's an amazing pleasure to be standing here today in front of you. I'm very excited about the topics that we're going to cover over the next hour or so, and I would like this to be interactive. So I'm happy to be interrupted if you have a burning question that you want to ask, but I am assured that we'll also have some time at the end of my presentation for question and answers. So I hope you have those ready too. So, very, very grateful to the Ghana Bar Association and the very, very insightful observations that were made right at the outset of this presentation. To the US Embassy, I received a badge and I feel so great to have this on my lapel. So thank you very much for that very warm embrace that I received just sitting at the high table. It's amazing what you get, right? And also for UPSA Law School having the vision to pull this all together. And of course, UC Law School in San Francisco, where this all started, and I've had the opportunity to lecture a number of students there on this fascinating topic. So, data, dignity, or supremacy. Where are we headed? I have a roadmap for our discussion, and I think every discussion starts initially with a connection. So I am so honoured to be connecting with you, and I hope we can continue those connections beyond this next few hours. I will speak about myself and introduce myself to you, and I will also offer some context and perspective. I'm hoping that context and perspective will allow us to take some time to reflect, because I think it's such a fast-moving area that we do need to have that space and that time for reflection. We will then consider whether we're heading towards a dystopia or a utopia. My doctor asked me what those words meant, and it was actually very interesting to think and reflect about this. So I will be asking you what your vision is of a world of data dystopia or utopia. We will then think about our beloved country's role in all of this. What is Ghana's position? Are we at the table? Are we sleepwalking into exploitation? I refer to digital colonialization. What does that term mean? We'll reflect on that. And we can start to form a path forward. Yes, we have that power through engagement, through consideration, through being involved. We can start to form our own path forward. And as wonderful as this is, it will of course come to an end. But in that ending, what I'm hoping is that we can find some new beginnings. So, that's the roadmap for discussion. Let's start with a connection. So this is me, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I mentioned my daughter. First and foremost, I am a mother. I am a working mother. 3 strong and, thank God, healthy children, who I was delighted to bring to Ghana from the UK. I wanted them to experience their country and their people. I'm also a lecturer, as has been mentioned. And in lecturing, I learn so much. I'm hoping to learn a lot from you, because I see this very much as an exchange of ideas, an exchange of vision, and an opportunity for us all. I'm also a CEO of a company that I founded 5 years ago. So it was mentioned that I've had long history working in the area of data protection. I worked in-house for a number of global companies, effectively as their data protection officer. So in that role, I was typically positioned in the legal function as a privacy officer and had responsibility of ensuring that these global companies that operated across Europe, often across the Middle East, Africa, the US, I had that responsibility of ensuring that they were complying with multiple data protection provisions and legislation. And so that global insight informed me when I set up my company, Hewitt Mills. What do we do? So we, as an organization, act as a data protection officer for multinationals. It's mentioned I was based in the UK. When I set up my company, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the European data protection legislation, was coming into effect. Under the GDPR, there is a requirement for organizations that process high volumes of data or sensitive information or track and monitor individuals. There is an obligation for them to appoint a data protection officer. Why do you think the European legislators thought it important for organizations to have what's called a data protection officer? Anybody want to volunteer a response on that? You're all being shy. Ladies, just raise your hands and come to me.
I believe one of the reasons is to make sure that data, especially personal data, is transmitted responsibly.
A star. That's correct. So essentially, what I do is I act as an independent observer on what an organization is doing with its data, including ensuring that data is used and transferred responsibly and in compliance. Because if you do not have an independent observer, the temptation is perhaps to not comply with all the rules if no one's watching, right? So as a data protection officer, we are an independent overseer of compliance within these organizations. And what does that mean? Well, that means effectively building programs where we look at their corporate governance, ensuring that the tone is set at the top of the organization, because that's very important. If the senior individuals within the organization, the board members, the ones that make the decisions, saying this area is important and we as an organization must meet compliance. Generally speaking, that has influence, it has an effect. We might want to think about that, not just in terms of organizations, but also in terms of governments. What is the tone at the top? Okay. The why of a data protection officer we've touched upon. It's about having an independent, qualified body that can help advise an organization on its responsibilities, but also to ensure that organization is maintaining compliance. And how do we do this? We do this in global partnership. So I set up an office in the UK, and I quickly, after establishing an office in the UK, opened an office in Dublin, in Europe. We will talk about the B word and Brexit and why that was so important to do in the course of this presentation. So, UK, Dublin. And then of course, the organisations that I'm partnering with operate across the globe. So we very quickly recognized that we needed to have operations in Germany, we have operations in Switzerland, we have operations in San Francisco, and of course, operations here in the motherland, Ghana, Accra. So we're a global company with over 60 people now operating, advising organizations on data protection compliance. And you have on the screen a snapshot of the types of organizations that we advise. So huge multinationals with over 150,000 employees to scale-ups, startups, organizations that operate in the technology sector, organizations that operate in life sciences, and everything in between that, and often hybrid organizations. So forming partnerships with progressive organizations wanting to meet compliance on data protection and privacy is important. And I actually, at this point, want to commend UPSA for having the vision to put together this sort of lecture and talk. It's so important for those who are shaping the law, for those who are teaching on the law professors, to have an understanding of this very fast-moving and important area. And also, to have the involvement of the Ghana Bar Association. I think this is going to be a very fruitful and strong and long-lasting relationship. So, where to next? Context and perspective. It was wonderful to have the presentation on Ghana's own legislation, the 2012 Act, which was born from your constitution, our constitution, I should say. I should reveal that I'm also Ghanaian, if you haven't picked up on that yet. I know I've been in England for a very long time, so the accent is not really speaking to my Ghanaian heritage. But my middle name is Nakushi. So, it was good to have an understanding of Ghana's own role in this. But if we work our way backwards, or should we say, if we start with the longest established legislation on this, it would be the EU GDPR. So why has Europe been so progressive in this area? Why did it develop data protection legislation? And why has it evolved data protection legislation in the way that it has? And I think sometimes the history is important. So Europe started to develop data protection legislation soon after the Second World War, 1945. Why did it feel so important to have data legislation in the aftermath of the Second World War? So, a little bit of history here. Take ourselves back to the Second World War. Databases being collected on the ethnicity and location of certain individuals. In particular, individuals whom powers at the time wanted to oppress. So, if you were Jewish, for example, that information was documented, and that information could be used against you. And it was at the time where databases were being formed. And after the Second World War, it was recognized that certain characteristics of individuals, if collected, could be used in a very oppressive and abusive way. So, gender, ethnicity, race, even trade union membership. Those sorts of information can be collected, stored, shared. Profiles can be built on individuals, and that can be used in a very oppressive way. So that was the genesis of building data protection legislation that required an increased amount of transparency and for information to be used responsibly and for serious consequences to result in any misuse of information. And there was the Data Protection Directive that came into effect in 1995 in Europe. And at that point, it was felt that actually the provisions were behind the technology. So this is something as a pattern that you will come to find with legislation. It tends to play catch up with what's actually happening on the ground. So Europe recognized that the 1995 legislation was drafted at a time where we didn't have these things, these mobile phones that could collect vast amounts of data and information. There was no Facebook, no Snapchat, social media platforms that were able to harvest huge amounts of data, more data than any government really had. And there was an understanding that the legislation had to evolve, had to keep up with the development and evolution of technology. So that resulted in the 2018 GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And the GDPR is thought to be the most advanced global legislation requiring organizations across Europe in a unified way to raise the bar on data protection standards. So it's the gold standard on data protection. And often, European legislators look across the Atlantic to US colleagues, and the question that's asked is, how can we ensure that the data that's being extracted from Europe and sent to the US is afforded the same level of protection as we now have established in Europe over all these years? Because when we look across the pond, what we see is a very fragmented data protection regime. Yes, you may have some provisions in relation to education, or yes, you may have some provisions in relation to financial services, but there's no umbrella protection. It's not quite treated in the same way as a fundamental human right as it has been in Europe because of Europe's history on it. It was a life and death situation if data about you was captured and was placed in the wrong hands. And so we start to see in the US now a number of states have recognized the need to offer better protection to individuals when it comes to privacy. And so California, hence my association with the California Law School, are probably the leading state in terms of data protection rights for individuals. They introduced the CCPA, their own version of a privacy framework to protect the rights of individuals in 2018, which has also been evolved very recently. So the California, position has perhaps inspired other states So we know Virginia and Utah and other states are developing state legislation which is due to come into effect this year or next year. And all of this is really resulting in some very strong lobbying for a federal law on data protection in the US. So we will have to watch the space and see how this evolves. But certainly, with emerging technologies such as AI, with the vast influence that social media giants such as Meta and Google and Amazon and other online technology giants have, there has certainly been in recent years a shift, I would say, in the US, and a recognition that it's not possible to stand still on this. And interestingly, a shift also in the expectations of individuals. So I was very interested to hear that what about individual responsibility? Because the responsibility has to start with us. And are we really thinking about the way in which we use and share, disclose information online? So that's an example of some of the past developments on data protection law. What is the context of all of this? Where are we now? So what's happening in the present? Let's look at the next slide. So we talked about this globalization. We are increasingly interconnected. We have emerging technologies such as AI, ChatGPT, machine learning. I can start to send a text message and the technology predicts what I might want to say next. How scary is that? Doesn't always get it right, which actually assures me that I am in control, right? Do we have technologies that will start to predict what an essay, an essay might look like? So could we just enter that information into a ChatGPT system to produce that right result? Organizations wanting to know more and more about us. Because if I know where you want to go on holiday, and what clothes you like to wear, and what you like to eat, and who your friends are, then I can provide very targeted services to you that are bespoke. But where is my autonomy in all of that? Where is my choice? Can you imagine walking into a shop and being followed, and everything you stop to look at is noted down? And then if you decide to go for a break in the loo, then that's tracked as well. That would be a very strange world, wouldn't it? It's happening right now. When you're online, these things called cookies, and they make it sound so benign. Ooh, cookies, I want more of those. Right? You mean more cookies? Yes, I accept. It's going to be helpful to me. Why not? So we're gorging on cookies and not thinking about the implications. We're not thinking about who we're feeding this information to. And do we have legislation in place that could even protect us against this overuse? But organizations want to know more. They want to know more about you. They want to know about your health. They want to know how many beats per minute your heart is beating. They want to tell you in advance if you're going to get diabetes. Is that a good or a bad thing? What are we comfortable with? These are all very important questions for us to consider. And this is the present. This is happening right now. What about the future? Well, our future is going to be shaped by what I refer to as the trust economy. We were maybe sleepwalking into data-driven insights, where we had cookies on our terminals and we just accepted them because we didn't know what they did. And we just volunteered information whenever we bought something at a store, whether it was our email or our waist size or where we lived, because we just wanted to buy that suit or have that dress and we didn't really think about the implications. Or maybe we allowed photographs to be taken at our children's schools and really not thinking about the implication of what that might mean in the future. So all these things were things of the past. In the future, there is going to be questions around trust. Can I trust this organization? Can I trust this university? Can I trust this business? Can I trust this school? Can I trust this government to respect my data and uphold my data dignity? And more discernment in terms of, well, what am I getting out of this? You see, I've given you my data, but what's the benefit for me? Is there a financial benefit for me? Is there a societal benefit? Well, if there is, spell it out, let me know. Let me make an informed choice. And that has to be baked into the legislation. It has to be baked into the guidance. There are certain positions of power that we would look to. The Data Protection Commissioner, the minister responsible for data protection. How are you ensuring that there is a fair exchange of data? How are you mitigating the risk of data exploitation and the compromise to privacy? Hence the question around regulatory enforcement. Because for individuals, they want the assurance that when organizations or institutions abuse that power, that there will be consequences. And a need to also think about, in this context, the most vulnerable groups being children. Because they have no choice. They have no protection. They have the exposure online and in schools. And they, of course, are our future. So what world are we going to leave for them if we don't think about the direction of travel of all of this and how they can be better protected online? Because as is mentioned, there are definitely opportunities there, but there are also real risks. Risks of addiction, risks of bullying, risks of discrimination. And how do we ensure that we have legislation that's fit for the future, that can safeguard vulnerable groups in this context? So these are topics for the future. And sometimes when we think about the future, it's good to have some perspective. So let's reflect on the last few decades. The The world in 1973 can be described as an analog world, right? Lots of paper, lots of bureaucracy, and we are moving 50 years later to digitalization. We're not fully there. When I landed in Kotoka Airport, I had my card that I had to complete on the flight. I had my yellow fever leaflet. Goodness me, the panic when you can't find that leaflet, yes? But I also had my fingerprints taken. I had a photograph of myself taken. So there was biometric data being processed. So I sort of felt like I was walking through this hybrid of moving out of the analog and into the digital. And we know that COVID has fast-tracked a lot of the digital evolution, or even revolution, we'll call it. So in 50 years, we've come a long, long way on our digital journey. And it's moving so fast, it's almost impossible to think of, well, where might we be in 20 years' time? So moving out of the digital into the machine learning, where there's a lot that machines are going to do that we are currently engaged in presently. A lot of manual processing and thinking that will be machine driven. That is going to require significant amounts of data and significant amounts of data regulation. Are we going to be doing this in a piecemeal way? Are we going to be doing it in a joined-up way? How are we going to approach the inevitable move from analog to digital to machine? What does the future look like? And we talked about these two worlds. Are we entering dystopia, or are we entering utopia? Let's start in dystopia. A world that is unjust, and a world of digital suffering. What does that look like? Who will suffer most? To a data protection officer, dystopia is a world where access is denied. You don't get to participate in the advantages, but we'll take your data and we will use it for our benefit, because we make the rules. We create the platforms. You have no choice because we have a monopoly, but to sit back and not participate. Your access is denied. Your rights are denied because you have no voice against the machine. Someone has printed, published, spread inaccurate information about you. What's your recourse? Do you have a right to correction? Do you even know what's out there about yourself? In digital dystopia, the answer is no. You have no rights. No access, no rights, no dignity. That lack of dignity is built in by design because you're unaware of your digital rights. The technology is already in place. It's already feeding on your information. And if that's the case, that's a very oppressive world. And if it impacts people in so-called developing countries in a disproportionate way because their legislation, the rules, are not sufficiently advanced to protect them, that to me looks very much like a world of digital colonialism. Will we sit back and allow for that to happen? Or can we envisage a utopian world? A world where we are active participants in digital transformation. A world where that education starts early. Where our children are learning to code. So the bias is not built in to the code. Because without that, there is no participation. We are users of the technology without any understanding of how the technology is built and how it's designed. It's a world where organizations are held accountable for their behavior. And when I say an organization, I'm talking about the C-suite. The boards are responsible for the decisions that are made internally. And governments are also responsible and accountable and care about their people's data. And so, from the classroom to the boardroom to the highest levels of power, there is awareness. There is accountability, there's transparency, and there is equity, there is fairness in the way data is utilized. Both worlds, as I stand here today, are possible, actually. And this is where education is key, and having an understanding of the role that we as lawyers can play and champions of human rights can play. So, Ghana's role in all of this. Do we believe in protecting or innovating? And it's interesting because I've asked this question as a DPO, a data protection officer, these organizations that I have the responsibility to oversee compliance in. And they say, Deanne, how can we innovate if all the focus is on protection? And my answer is simple. It's not a zero-sum game. The two are not mutually exclusive. We can and we must do both, because one will result in the other. Protection will lead to increased innovation. It will build trust. Back to that phrase, trust economy. We're gonna be a trust economy. Are we going to embrace the technology? Or are we going to try and shut it down? We talked about the Industrial Revolution, and I remember studying the Luddites. Who remembers the Luddites? Come across that term? Yes. Where this idea of technology was something to be feared and needed to be shut down and stopped. Printing press, who wants that? We'll have no jobs. But of course, it's not possible to shut it down. We need to think about ways in which our own influence and our own voice and the direction that we want to travel as we navigate these choppy digital waters can be realised. Are we going to adopt an individualistic or a community-based approach to solving some of these very challenging issues? The West has a very individualistic approach, individual rights, protecting the individual. But interestingly, increasingly also thinking about community-based solutions. Because there's that phrase, we go fast alone, we go further together. So there has to be a balance. And again, we saw during COVID times the benefits of community-based solutions in healthcare. But there has to be the accountability built into that, or there won't be trust. People will shy away from sharing their data for the benefit of community if they feel that that sharing is only going to benefit a small percentage of individuals. And this takes us to the idea of national legislation and supranational legislation. Is there strength in working together with other nations as opposed to going it alone? And it was mentioned at the top of this presentation that I was an ethics advisor to the European Commission. And it's very, very interesting to be in that position and to see how Europe approaches this. So whenever there is the issuing of a grant to sponsor a particular research study, a panel of experts is assembled, and we as a panel have to consider whether there are good ethical standards baked into the research. And we consider this from a European data protection legislation perspective and other European legislative acts. I wonder whether there's the same approach, Pan-African approach, in the grant of research projects. Do we have a panelist of data ethicists and data protection practitioners looking at this and protecting the interests of our people from a legislative perspective, a Pan-African legislative perspective? So what's the path forward then? How we create fertile ground for digital growth. We are starting out on this journey. We are but children in our understanding. What do children need? Well, of course, we need guidance on this. There needs to be an explanation of what the implications are, and we look to those in power to offer that guidance. There has to be control. You will not let a child run across the road. You will control that child. We cannot allow for technology and organisations to use information without any accountability or control. There needs to be corrective action and enforcement where that's necessary. But we also have to allow room for creativity. Over-regulation, disproportionate regulation, can actually get in the way of creativity. And I mentioned the innovation is required as well as the protection. And this way we strike that balance, creating the right path forward. So, I've walked us through some of the history. We've talked about the here and now and the implications, and we've also started to envisage what the path forward might look like. I want to say a little more about my journey. You see, I first came to Accra as a baby in 1973, which we refer to almost 50 or so years ago. I was encouraged to go into the law when my mother, who served as a judge for her beloved country, Ghana, Justice Iris May Brown. She almost disowned me because I thought I could go into marketing rather than law. She said, no. You were born to be a lawyer. So I followed in her footsteps. And I was last here in Ghana a year ago to celebrate her 77th birthday. She served for 18 years on the bench, retired from the Court of Appeal in 2010. She passed away, sadly, in October. And I feel her presence now because she gave to her country. And I'm hoping in sharing my insights on data protection and privacy and security that I can somehow, in my way, also give to my country and continue that legacy that she said. She really instilled in me this belief, acting always with integrity, with passion and positivity, and to continuously innovate. And I'm hoping that if we can create legislation that has built into it by design integrity, if we can think with positivity about our future, and if we can continue to innovate without fear, we can indeed build a future that's fit for the children that will inherit it. Thank you.